Hi everyone, this is the fourth lesson on HOSA behavioral health. Today we'll be talking about sensation and perception. Table of contents. First, we'll talk about some basics of perception and the detection of signals. Then we'll talk about the visual system, the auditory system, and touching and feeling. So let's do a quick review and a case study of last week, which was mainly about the biological components of psychology and behavioral health. Well, we have this famous case study with Phineas Gage, who was a railroad worker. He was generally likable by most of his superiors and coworkers, and he was very diligent. However, on one day, he was doing a rather risky scenario, and he was doing a rather risky procedure, and the iron tamping rod passed through his frontal lobe during an explosion. It pierced through his skull into his brain during the accident, and he survived, right? He got up, but after that, his friends and acquaintances declared that he was no longer Gage. So what happened to him? Well, the tamping rod pierced through his frontal lobe, which controls mental skills like reasoning and self-control, primarily self-control. And Gage lost the impulse control, and he started to develop a habit of swearing in public with no care. His personality and other aspects also began to become relatively animalistic. However, there are many exaggerated reports about things that he allegedly did, which are untrue and aren't backed up by the primary sources of the time. Still, it serves as a rather interesting case study for the purpose of the frontal lobe, and this is important for case studies in general. It's supposed to uh, teach you something about the functions in behavioral health and sciences in general by specific scenarios which you wouldn't be able to pass with the review boards in terms of ethics. So there are these very special cases that we'll come back to time and time again during our studies. So first, perception and signals. Now, two definitions. Sensation is directly related to the five senses, right? It's the process of detecting environmental stimuli and stimuli arising from the body. Actually, the stimuli arising from the body is quite interesting. There are some forms of thinking where there's actually six or seven senses. For example, a person could perceive uh, and see a beautiful sunset, or they could feel an upset stomach. A perception would be the interpretation of that sensory information. For example, friends voting for different presidential candidates in an election will probably come to very different conclusions about their performance in the debate. So first, let's talk about sensation in detail. So how does it happen? It's the interaction between physical stimulus and our biological sensory systems. A stimulus can be anything that can elicit a response from our senses, and transduction is the process in which the incoming sensory information is translated into neural signals, which are then sent to the brain. By the time it is sent to the brain, it's up for interpretation, which is perception. It allows us to organize, recognize, and use information provided by the senses. A phenomenon that happens with perception is sensory adaptation, where things that occur for quite a while you get used to, right? Things that are constant or unchanging, even if the stimulus is there, you will stop noticing it because because of how constant it is. Your brain will drown it out. There is a similar phenomenon with the cocktail effect, which is where in a party, even though many names are being called out in conversations, eventually, if someone calls out your name in the midst of all the conversation, you will be able to immediately spot it. This is also because of some syndromes as some phenomenon in perception. Now, another example is that you may pay attention to the sound of your heating system turning on or the moment it turns off because there is this change in the sound. But if it's constantly running, you will probably not pay attention to it. Uh, a common example, a more interesting example, is the backrooms. And even though you have all of these copy pastas, even if you already know what it is, but imagine for a second that you didn't, well, you would still probably be able to perceive that there's something wrong with the room, right? There's something off about it. The way that it's angled, the way that the artist drew it, the yellow hue, right? These are all things that are intended to create an eerie effect. There are two types of perception. There's bottom up and there's top down. For bottom up, it's perception based on building simple things into more complex ideas and perceptions. For example, if a person has never heard the song Never Gonna Give You Up and does not know the concept of being rickrolled, they might think that the song is pretty nice just judging purely by the sensory information that they're getting from it. Uh, and top-down perception is where previous memory and knowledge is used to guide upcoming sensory information and how our brain processes it and perceives it. For example, if you've heard the song before and you're very annoyed at being rickrolled, you might have a loathing reaction to the first snare hits in the song, and you might immediately have the negative association. Another example of bottom-up processing and top-down processing might be, for example, if you have some distinct dislike for a certain type of food. That type of food is used as an ingredient in a soup. If you like the soup, that is purely because of bottom-up perception where you don't know that that ingredient is there. However, if someone tells you that that ingredient is in the soup, you might instantly start to dislike it and notice it. Now, here's an example where the two perception types are used literally simultaneously together at the same time. All you have to do to make a sentence readable is to make sure that the first and last letters of each word stay the same. Bottom up is responsible for the sensation of the letter shape sent to the brain, and top down helps you recognize the words due to previous knowledge of the English alphabet. Now, measuring perception. Uh, there's three terms that are related to this. So psychophysics is a study of relationships between physical qualities of stimuli, and the sensations and perceptions that they produce. So what type of stimulus creates what type of perception? The absolute threshold is the smallest amount of stimulus that can be detected. Now, there's a ratio for this where it has to be for 50% of the time. And in an experiment, for example, the tick of a wristwatch under quiet conditions might finally be hearable with the subject 20 feet away, might finally be audible when the subject is 20 feet away. The just noticeable difference, meanwhile, is the smallest detectable difference between two stimuli. For example, a difference in the tempo of the same audio track might be noticeable when there is a 4 beats per minute difference. There are experiments with signal detection, which is an analysis of sensory and decision making in the process of detecting faint, uncertain stimuli. Now, there's two processes related to this, right? So, sensory is the actual intensity of the stimulus, which influences the observer's belief of whether or not a stimulus actually occurred, whereas decision making involves the individual observer's personal criteria about whether the stimulus occurred and what type of and what type of criteria do they have for themselves. In signal detection experiments, there are four types of outcomes. First, if the participant response is yes and the stimulus is present, then it's a hit. If the stimulus is absent, then it's a false alarm. However, if the participant says there is no stimulus and the stimulus is present, then it's a miss. Whereas if the stimulation is indeed absent, then it's a correct rejection. I hope these terms are rather self-explanatory and you'll be able to pick them up quite easily. Now, second, how we see. Vision is the processing of light reflected from objects. It's one of the most important sensory systems in humans, and it accounts for 50% of our cerebral cortex's processes. Now, there are many parts to the biology of vision. So it starts in the cornea, which is the clear surface of the eye at the front, at the eye bulb, which process and directs the light into the retina, which is at the back. The pupil is an opening formed by the iris, and that's what lets the light in. Now, we hear often of our pupils dilating in the night, in the darkness, and that's so that more light gets in, and it adapts so that you can see easier in the dark. In some sort of way, humans actually do have night vision, whereas the pupils will constrict if it is suddenly bright. You can actually see this for yourself if you switch the lights off and you look at yourself in a mirror and then switch the lights back on. You can actually see your pupils starting to constrict. The iris is the brightly colored circular muscle surrounding the pupil of the eye. It's what allows that movement of the pupil. The lens is the clear structure behind the pupil that bends light towards the retina, which is the layer of visual processing cells. There's two of them in the back of the eye, right? So there's rods and there's cones. We'll discuss those in the next slide. A fovea is the area of the retina that is specialized for highly detailed vision. Now, here is a basic diagram of the front and the back of the eye. It's a cross section. You can take a look at the actual physical components if you like and pause the video. Now, rods are photoreceptors specialized to detect dim lights, while cones are photoreceptors specialized for color. They're in the retina, so you do have to remember that the human eye contains more rods than cones, specifically 120 million rods and 6 million cones. Uh, so let's talk briefly about the visual pathway. There's actually a blind spot in the optic nerve where there are no rods or cones. Your brain actually fills these gaps so that you don't notice them. The optic nerve is the nerve exiting the retina of the eye, which then travels through what we call the optic tract, which are nerve pathways traveling from the optic chiasm to the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the midbrain. Now, we'll talk about color vision theories. There's two of them. First, the trichromatic theory is based on the existence of different types of cones for the detection of short, medium, and long wavelengths. You might learn this in grade 10 biology, so short is blue, medium is green, and long are red wavelengths. It's explained by observations of three primary colors of light. It also explains color deficiency in some sort of way because there's like one specific color deficiency. However, it doesn't explain after images, which we'll get to in the next color theory. Now, the opponent process theory is a theory of color vision that suggests we have red-green color channel and a blue-yellow color channel in which activation of of one color in each pair inhibits the other. Most people have three types of cones. It's very rare to see one or none. If you have none, then you see the world in black and white. Now, most people who have two types of cones are colorblind. You're supposed to have three. Now, here is the process of after images, right? So after images, it demonstrates opponent process theory because what happens is, and I want you to take a look and stare at the guy in the middle's nose. I want you to stare at him for a while. You can even pause the video. Essentially, what happens is um, one of the receptors gets fatigued. Oh, so one end of the opponent process cone gets fatigued and stops seeing that color, so that when you switch to a neutral background, you actually are meant to see nothing at all, but actually you see the opposite color. Right now it's just black and white, so when I flip the slide to a blank slide, you should actually be able to see the reverse of this image, which would be normal. Are you ready? So maybe if the experiment worked, then you would be able to see the beetles in normal black and white, even though they're not there at all. And then your cones will stop overcompensating and recover. and then you will see a blank slide like normal. Now, Gestalt principles of vision there are five of them. So you have the organization principle, which is analyzing visual input by dividing the scene into figure and ground. The proximity principle is the fact that we group images that are close together into a single components as a single component. The continuity principle is that we assume that points which form smooth lines are connected to each other. Closure principle is the idea of filling in the blanks when there's something that's almost complete but isn't. And the simplicity principle is that we interpret the simplest solution to a problem. So the organization principle, right? So we have the focal point, which is the seashell, and the background, which is the sand. Proximity principle, the red and the green are two different groups, and these two groups on the right image are spaced separately. There is a good division, so we see two groups as well. Continuity principle would allow us to see one entire curved line instead of simply a series of dots. Closure principle will allow us to easily imagine a completed diamond without those gaps, and the simplicity principle allows us to interpret this black and white image as simply a couch. Now, depth perception is quite interesting. It's the ability to use two-dimensional images projected on the retina to perceive three dimensions. So monocular cues are what artists use because uh, these are mainly for two-dimensional images, right? And they exploit these techniques. So it's a depth cue that requires the use of only one eye, texture, gradients, and shading. And binocular cues are depth cues that requires the use of both eyes. So for example, retinal disparity, which are differences in the images seen in each eye, allow us to spot tiny variation in depth, which is how we perceive some things which are farther away than others. There is also a thing called convergence, which is the fact that when objects are closer, your eyes literally have to converge, which is why when you try to look at something very close, like your nose, your eyes look crossed, whereas if you look at something very far away, your eyes straighten out and look directly forward. Your brain can detect this, which is how you might be able to perceive something that are closer or farther away compared to each other. Now, this is so with depth, the brain can play tricks on you, and you can manipulate these cues, these binocular cues, right? So you can, with a two-point perspective, you can make it so that it seems like two people of similar height are significantly different in height than one another by making a room expand on one side and place that person to the back, right? And then increase the height of the room. And then on the other hand, make it so that the wall is so small on the other side, and but then also bring it closer so that it actually looks like it's straightened um, as you take a look from a forward direction. Now, now we'll discuss how we hear, which is audition. So there are primarily six ear structures which I want you to memorize for this. So the pinna collects sound waves and directs them into the auditory canal. That's part of the outer ear. The auditory canal transmits the sound waves to the tympanic membrane, which then vibrates in response to the sound waves. Those transmit the vibrations into the ossicles, which are three types of bones. Now the cochlea, the basilar membrane, converts the sound vibrations into neural signals via hair cells movement. And the organ of corteus, which is also in the cochlea, contains hair cells that detect sound vibrations and send the signals to the brain. The auditory nerve, like the visual pathway, transmits electrical signals from the cochlea to the brain for sound processing, right? So we have our auditory ear, which um, focuses sound and localizes it. So basically, the pinna allows you to determine if the sound is coming from forwards or backwards or above or below the head. The auditory canal then sends those sound waves inwards, and the tympanic membrane receives it. Now, the innermost part of the ear contains the cochlea, the auditory nerve, semicircular canals, and the vestibular nerve. The cochlea contains the basilar membrane, which is what contains the organ of Corti, which is located on the basilar membrane, and it contains the auditory receptors. And here is a complete diagram of the components of the ear. And also, what happens is that finally it will reach the thalamus, which receives the auditory input from the brainstem and connects it to the primary auditory cortex. Uh, and the primary auditory cortex is an area in the temporal lobe that receives the auditory input from the thalamus and performs the initial analysis of the input. Now, finally, we'll talk about perception and signals. So somatosensation is the body senses, which include body position, touch, skin temperature, and pain. And somatosensory stimuli, which I briefly discussed earlier, which is the senses that are coming from literally inside the body, or it arises with, or out from outside the body, like environmental stimuli. It arises from within the body itself, or makes contact, or from a stimuli that makes contact with the body's surface. So we have the sensory homunculus, which translates to little man, and it illustrates the amount of representation each part of the body has in the sensory cortex. It's actually a bit outdated and proven to be inaccurate and inconsistent now. The reason is slightly complex. So the human homunculus, what I want you to pay attention to is that the face and the hands are very, very large. Now, the vestibular system is a system in the inner ear that provides information about body position and movement. These are the two parts of the ear that I blacked out from the previous slide. So the vestibular information travels from the medulla to the thalamus and then to the primary somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe and then to the primary motor cortex in the frontal lobe. So this pathway allows the information to guide movement. So the two pathways I want you to remember are the one for the ear, right, which then leaves and receives the information to the brain, and the vestibular system, which then finally goes to the primary motor cortex. So these last two parts, the semicircular canals, help maintain balance by detecting rotational movements of the head. The vestibular tissue works with the semicircular canals to detect head position and movement, which guides balance. Yeah. Touch and pain. So what does touch do? Well, the purpose of touch is to confirm our visual exploration of objects, right? We can actually never be certain if something is actually farther away than the other until we touch it. We can never actually feel the texture of something unless we touch it. We can actually, we can't even determine if something is actually solid or not, right? For example, holograms, until we touch it. Our skin is embedded with specialized neurons, and the touch information travels from the skin to the spinal cord to the thalamus, which is then transmitted to the primary somatosensory cortex and the parietal lobe, which manages taste, hearing, sight, touch, and smell. So these are the five primary senses, which are also, and touch is just one of them. Now, pain is free nerve endings which are triggered and are associated with tissue damage. That's why pain is so important, because when you have pain, that means that there's something wrong. And you should know that there's something wrong with your body, because then you can avoid worsening the tissue damage, which is essentially the death of cells. Now, gate control theory is this idea that pain messages travel to the brain, but they can be modified with competing sensory signals, which are also incoming. For example, if you just bumped your elbow very painfully, you might rub it in order to dilute the pain. Why? So the model is that the input from touch fibers competes with the input from pain receptors, and those basically compete for the activation of cells in the spinal cord. The activation of the touch fibers effectively dilutes the amount of pain information which reaches the brain. So there's a gate in the spinal cord, right? And then an event or an injury would determine how open or how closed the gate is. And the factors that open the gate, like which make you more prone to being hurt or lower your tolerance for pain, are things like chronic stress, whereas factors close the gate include rubbing your elbow or high levels of arousal in general, which may be competing for triggering cells in the spinal cord. At taste and smell, we have a diagram there. But the most important things are olfaction and gestation, which are the sense of smell and the sense of taste, respectively. So the olfactory nerve are nerves that carry the olfactory information from the receptors to the bulbs. And the olfactory bulb is one of two structures below the frontal lobe of the brain, and it receives input from the olfactory receptors of the nose. So basically, it's a structure in the brain responsible for smell. Now, taste, you have papillae and taste buds. So, papillae are small bumps on the tongue, whereas taste buds are the structures found on the papillae, and those contain taste receptors. That's it for today's lesson. If you do have any questions, please leave them down in the comments below, and I can give you a more thorough explanation. And thank you for listening to this lesson. See you next week. Bye.